Welcome to the London Stock Exchange live marketplace discussion that zooms in on the topic of board management relations. As companies continue to navigate through challenging times, more eyes will be focused on their strategic leadership. But having an effective and fit-for-purpose board is not only about the talent in the boardroom. It's not only about competency, but it's about how to use this talent to its fullest potential and maximize the value contribution from both sides, the executives and non-executives. We have a panel with us today to discuss this topic. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Niamh Corbett from Board Intelligence, Oliver Cummings from Nurole, and Monica Lagercrantz from BoardClic. As a reminder, the audience is very welcome to pose their questions through the Q&A function on their screen. And let's dive into the specific subtopic on the vital role of the chair-CEO dynamic. So, Monica, I would like to turn to you. You are privy to extensive data on confidential board evaluation. So why is the chair-CEO dynamic so important? What are the building blocks and what are the warning signs to look out for?
Yes, that's a very interesting topic. When answering that, I would like to first establish the role of the chairman, because we all know most often the role of the board. We think we know that at least, and it varies, but also the role of the chairman varies. I think that's important to remember. She can be a facilitator, can be an expert, and actually of our data in BoardClic, 73% of the board members using BoardClic consider the chairman a facilitator. I think that's interesting to establish. So, but in addition to that, it's for the chairman to set the bar, really. It's about the ambition in the board, in the company, in the value that's being created. And so that's the role she has. So how to do that? Obviously, it's to build trust. There's nothing more important. And mutual respect in addition to that. I think that gives the value that is created in the board and between the chairman and the CEO. And with mutual respect and trust, the CEO can stay totally honest and transparent, which is most important. It's critical. And that's really the key pillars for the CEO to do his or her job. So the chair is channeling the ambition, but it's also very important for the chair to understand how to, in a good balancing way, put pressure on the CEO, because most CEOs, it's difficult to be a CEO. And the chair must really understand how to pressure, but also support in order for the CEO to focus on her tasks. And trust also is spiraling ambition in a very good way. And our data shows that the strong chair and CEO interaction actually even impacts innovation close to more than 50% increase in a company. So everything starts with transparency and an open dialogue, but it's also very important, we have picked up, that not everything needs to go to the full board. So the relationship between the chair and the CEO is based also on their own personal relationship. It's a form of coaching, you can almost say, and not everything needs to go into the minutes. So it needs to be a bit informal, formal and informal, and confidential. That's key. And 28% of the CEOs we work with wish they had more of that kind of time with the chair. So, but it's also for the chair to adjust to the CEO. If you have an ambitious CEO, then the chair needs to adjust. Less ambitious CEO, okay, you need to step up and raise the bar. So it's being very agile. Something else I wanted to mention is also that to be a very successful chair, you need to be entrepreneurial, because the CEOs these days need to be entrepreneurial. So you need to be agile and go with the times, what I can say. So less risk and governance and more of flexibility and entrepreneurship. So you asked about signs to watch out for. I think clearly when the respect starts to crack, that's the first sign. You can often see that in the style of communication and the demands. Unclarity and blurry lines between the CEO and the chair, and also when you take into account the board, the CEO then is easily exceeding her mandate, which could be devastating. Good for you, because then you most often recruit a new CEO. The CEO is too strong. That's also something. And a CEO, a C-suite, always have an advantage in terms of information. That's clear. A chair, on the other hand, can also become too operational. So those are some warning signs. And something else is that when the CEO does not involve key employees, being alone on stage is never a good thing.
Thank you, Monica. And it's a perfect point to bring the next question to Oliver. In your role, recruiting non-executive directors, including chairs, sometimes it might be the case that there is something wrong with this dynamic. So in that case, what have gone wrong in your experience?
Yeah, I think Monica sort of touched on a lot of the key points. I think what's interesting is it's not consistent between, is it the chair at fault, is it the CEO at fault, or is it a combination of the two? We see all three scenarios. And key often is that sort of personality clash, which stems from a lack of respect. And sometimes that can be because CEO and chair are too overlined in their competences. And sometimes it can be because they're too far apart in their competences. Often we'll see a mindset issue in the CEO where they see the board as a necessary evil and they don't see the board as a resource. There's another common reason is when boards and chairs get that balance wrong between support and challenge. And it can go both ways. You can get boards that are only challenge and effectively it becomes an us and them dynamic. But then you can also see boards that only support and they've effectively become a rubber stamping unit for an autocratic CEO. Trust is a big piece, and that often steps, touching on what Monica said, from surprises. And it can, again, surprises can happen both ways, where you get boards springing surprises on the exec, or the exec springing surprises on boards. You break down that psychological safety, and it's very difficult to repair. And often that's because the right communication channels are not in place outside of the boardroom, the right frequency, cadence. And then the last one will just be a fundamental misalignment on vision and purpose, where they haven't spent enough time actually documenting what they think and ironing out the differences.
Thank you. Another reminder to the audience that we will have some poll questions on your screen. It will be very interesting for us to analyze it thereafter, but it's also for your interest, and these polls are aligned with the topics we're discussing right now. And so, Oliver, you mentioned that there are two distinct groups of people in the boardroom, and it's essential to draw a line between their responsibilities in order to maximize the value and the contribution. So with that, I would like to turn to Niamh and ask a question about objective setting. How do you align the entire board around a core set of strategic priorities, and how do these strategic priorities get translated into key questions for management around the boardroom table?
Yep, absolutely. And I think the key thing to distinguish here to start is there is often a difference between the board's priorities and the executive's priorities, especially on a strategic level. So if we take how you align the board around a set of key strategic priorities, we have a model that we use at Board Intelligence called the 6 conversations model that looks at across the dual steering and supervising role of the board. So the fact-checking versus the decision-making roles of the board, across the dual steering and supervising role, across the 3 different lenses of strategy, performance, and governance, what are the 6 key cornerstone conversations that they should be having at any one point? You then look at where are they currently spending their time in board meetings versus where they want to be spending their time in board meetings. And inevitably you find, before you set out those strategic priorities, where they feel they're spending more time is down on the operational side, it's down in the performance, it's in the weeds of the detail. If you ask them where they would like to be spending more time and why they came onto the board in the first place, it is to be involved more in those strategic discussions, the bigger directional vision pieces as to where the organisation is going and how they can help lead that. So using that model, you can then establish a core set of priorities and where you need to spend your time on those in the agenda. What you then look at is how do you take those priorities, which will be quite high level, how do you then translate them into a series of quite specific questions that then form the basis of not only the conversations that the board members are having in the board meeting, but they then form the basis of the management reports that come to the board. So management know wherever a report is written in the organisation, the key questions that are being asked are the same, and those questions are very much aligned to the strategic pillars of the organization. You need to have agreement on what they are, and then you translate them into reporting. Those board priorities will necessarily be separate from the executive priorities. The executive priorities will be more operationally focused and more to do with actually managing the day-to-day business. But if you start at the arc of the board and translate it, that then helps align not just the flow of information, but the way that agenda items are considered and the board's conversations. It all very much aligns around the same direction.
Thank you, Niamh, for sharing that practical framework. I would like to next turn to Monica and discuss how do you actually maximize the contribution from both sides. And Oliver mentioned the concept of the necessary evil. So in order it not to be so, how should the boards maximize the value creation in relation to the CEO, and how can the CEO leverage the board's competencies? It goes both ways.
Absolutely, it goes both ways.
Yeah.
So apart from the most obvious tasks for the board, hire and fire the CEO, approve strategic priorities, and monitor risks, the board basically is there to support and challenge the CEO. So how is that done? If we look at how the board best sort of maximize the value in relation to the CEO, the best chairs these days are very explicit when asking the CEO, what do you need? What do you need from us? Clear and simple questions. Could be 2 questions before, well, in advance of board meetings. Specify what you want us to focus on and prepare, and then we deal with that. That's a very simple but powerful manner. Also, as I mentioned earlier, from the board's perspective, is of course to just in terms of different CEOs, different cycles of the company, different phases, and so on. And I think we touched on that. Again, finding balance between challenging and supporting, and be very thoughtful in what you ask from the CEO. And the best boards also in relation to the CEO is focused on giving another perspective, and often the longer term perspective, but often also just another perspective. These days, we see in BoardClic that it's much more common to work with a high number of scenarios as well, because of where the world is going. So it's also setting those scenarios and giving a perspective on those. And BoardClic, we are an analytics platform for advanced evaluations. We, of course, see that really professional board evaluations should be used, because that's where the board gets the feedback from the CEO, how to maximize the value output. So that's an obvious manner. Feedback is always very important. And again, in terms of how the board should be working, is really to interact with key employees. As I mentioned earlier, we see in BoardClic that 30% of the highest performing boards have a high level of key employee interaction. So that's a super good way to work, I think. If you look at how the CEO can maximize, McKinsey recently wrote an article about the best CEOs understand how to really leverage the board. I think it's all about that you have the right competences in the board. You as CEO, you are very explicit what you need and who should be on the board. And also that to have self-insight as the CEO, that you cannot know everything. It's impossible for anyone running an organization today to know your company, your sector, data analytics, cybersecurity. So you need to harness the full intelligence of the board. I think that's very important. And also look at the way CEOs work with the board or chairman. It's much more about cooperation and communication these days. Earlier, it was much more governance and risk. They are still there, but much more like a cooperative environment. And some boards, some CEOs go the way that you set up the manner that board directors can have a direct line into members of your C-suite. Some like that, some don't, because it's a governance issue sometimes, and that you don't surpass the CEO. But if you set the right governance model, that can be a powerful way of giving more value.
Absolutely. And maximizing the value contribution is about the fine balance. So how do you, Oliver, assist boards in identifying candidates who can preserve and create this fine balance?
It's a great question. One of the classics that we see boards coming to us saying was we need someone with previous PLC experience. And usually when we dig into that, there's a small proportion of boards that genuinely need previous PLC experience because they haven't got anyone else on there with that level of technical detail. But more often than not, they're using it as a proxy for someone who knows how to operate on a board. And actually the pool of people who are able to do that is much broader. And so we would, they would tend to encourage them to look beyond that, and they start looking at people who've had other board experience. Or it might be in the non-profit sector, or it might be in a committee, or it might be in some given role. And actually what we see from a lot of the boards using the platform is when you sort of go out beyond that traditional pool of PLC experience, actually you can find some really exceptional people. The other area I'd say we sort of see boards differentiating themselves on that front is around the way they assess people. So the classic way they assess them at an interview is a one-to-one interview or a panel interview, but they never see that individual operating as part of a group, which is clearly a fundamental dynamic, and understanding how to operate with your fellow non-execs as well as the exec team. So really good boards are creating job-specific tests effectively for those board members to see how they operate in that dynamic and making sure they understand how to navigate the line between exec and non-exec.
Absolutely. It's interesting to take a look at the poll results here that have been oscillating, which shows that the best practices is still an evolving area in this particular question. So some people think that the executives could be more involved, some think that they're not as involved or more involved than necessary, but some clearly think that there is a fine balance. So these are the trends to watch out for. I would like to touch on the important topic of how actually boards get properly informed about the company stakeholder and their priorities, and how management is processing that information and delivering it most effectively into the boardroom to enable strategic decision making. And would like to turn to Niamh with the question about the expectations from the board papers, and in particular, what's the line for the board papers when they become too operational and they become effectively management papers, and how does that impact the conversation in the boardroom?
Absolutely, and it's something that we see a huge amount with board papers is they're not actually board papers. They're essentially management papers being given to the board, and that can be for a variety of different reasons. But actually, when papers are too operational, too detail heavy, and too data technical heavy, depending on the type of organization, what that then does is cloud the messaging between management and the board. So actually, Monica touched on it earlier. For the board members are saying, what do you want from me? What do you want back from me individually and us collectively? And the challenge of papers that are too operational is it tempts the board to then become operational and have operational conversations. And actually, it was exactly as you were saying, that give boards any chance to have operational conversations and get down into the weeds, they'll take it. But it's not their role. And so it's looking at how you give the board, we say the difference between what we call a worm's eye view and a bird's eye view, how you give the board the right information, but also touching on the relationship between the chair and the CEO, but also the board and the management team, that the board have confidence that the information they're being given is the right level and detail for them. So if that is less than they're expecting, or if it is at a higher level, then they can have confidence in the management team that the management are giving them the level of information that's appropriate for them. And the management team can have confidence that their committee structures and their governance structures are set up so that the information is being surfaced at the right areas in the organisations. The committees are doing their jobs properly, and therefore what comes to management and what then needs to come up to the board, the papers effectively get sliced at each level up to the top of the organisation. So when the board pack goes to the board, it only focuses on exactly what management want back from them, and it answers the key questions of what is on your mind as a management team, especially as a CEO. So if we take the CEO specifically, what the board will want to know is what is on your mind, what has gone well, what hasn't gone well, what are the implications of that, and what are you doing about it? That is essentially all they need to know from the board papers. But there needs to be that relationship between the board and the CEO. They can have confidence that you're being given the right information in the right level of detail.
Absolutely. To continue on that, it's also about the information flow back and forth. So, Monica, how do you balance this critical information flow? It's not only about what goes into the boardroom, but what comes out and goes back to the management.
I just want to comment on something you said. So, because board effectiveness, there's one global problem today, that's that boards are lacking time. So, the more blurry documentation, papers, etc., the harder it is to really have an efficient board agenda and they create value. So that's exactly what we could see as well. So exactly the information flow back and forth. So it's all about balancing information, supporting the company and all stakeholders. And today it's really stakeholder management. And there's only one role the board has, is to focus on the value creation, but then to balance all stakeholders. And of course, that's related, how you do that is related to many factors and the ownership structures. For instance, if you look at that, the owners vary. So that's one field that will set how you deal with that. Scattered ownership, more concentrated, etc. The thing is that information needs to be transparent, but then tailored to different groups. And that's really a hard work these days. Also, when you look at ESG, because the board need to work much more with searching questions, it's a field where more or less everyone needs to put searching questions. So that's one way of dealing with that topic. And of course, in listed companies like we are focusing now, all the inside regulation is getting tougher. So it's very limited what and when you can give information. But again, important that everyone gets information in tandem, but there are certain ways to deal with that, of course. And if you look on information between the board and the CEO, it's important, it's key that the board is updated on all details. I mean, boards do not like being held in the dark. It's definitely a no-go. But again, they don't want to be too much in the details. So it's a good balance. And I think it's the responsibility both from the CEO and the chairman to structure the information, including the papers, so it is exactly on the right level. Otherwise, you will never get an efficient board work. And directors these days, they're faced with so many responsibilities. So, and everyone, all groups demand a dialogue. So it's more and more common, and it's obvious that institutional investors are working directly with the IR investor relation team. But you need to have a very good governance model in order to not surpass the CEO and there are some risks with that, but structure and good governance is really key, and that's part of ESG. Of course, it's the G. It is the G. So I would say that's the main part that we have seen in BoardClic.
Thank you. And so, Oliver, what are some of the practical approaches that you've seen around in terms of facilitating that flow of information to enable a more effective board?
Yeah, so one of my favorite is the board to use advisory boards. We had recently a sort of M500 professional service firm looking to expand internationally, and they put together an advisory board of, it was a law firm. They brought in management consultants, accountants, lawyers at the partner level into their advisory board. And suddenly it created time and a safe space where it was very clear there was no governance there. It was all about helping that CEO think through their strategy. And what that does, by having that sort of outside party, you can shine a light very quickly, identify where the blockages are in the system. So, using that pattern recognition. So that's one really neat way that we see. The other related to that is a buddy system where they take those advisory board members and they match them up to functional leaders and have them working as mentors, but it's a two-way information flow, which allows the CEO or the rest of the board to understand the issues more and gets them more connected. You see quite a few boards using horizon boards, next generation boards, where they get sort of younger members or the next generation of leadership starting to feed in on the same challenges to make sure boards are aligned and also get fresh perspectives. And then I think the other interesting one that we're seeing more and more of is boards looking to get their executives a non-executive perspective. And I know from personal experience how difficult that change was when you're sitting on the executive side of the table you're sitting there thinking, how did the board not get this? And then you go and sit on the other side of the table as a board member, you think, how on earth are we supposed to do anything with this information you provided? And so having execs who really understand what it is to be a non-exec is very powerful and helps them get more out of the board. So those are some of the things.
Great, thank you. So now we would like to cover an important topic of actually building a culture of constructive debate and outcomes-focused governance, because we're talking about two distinct groups of people, the executives and non-executives that have their competencies, but yet they need to be united by common objectives. And at the same time, there needs to be enough room for a constructive challenge. So I would like to explore this topic a bit further, starting with Niamh. What are some of the implications, the practical implications of the board management relations, and how do they manifest themselves in terms of the outcomes?
We look at those practical applications in terms of agility and speed to change. So if you unpack agility, it can be one of two things. It can be your ability to spot risks and opportunities, and then your ability to adapt to those as an organization. And we find where you have a good board management relationship and when that is then facilitated by a good and appropriate flow of information, it does help organizations to become more agile. However agility is defined, and it will change for different types of organizations, but that ability then to have that insight into the business, to look at what they can change and how quickly they can adapt, because that communication line between the board and between the management team is there, it's effective, it's working, it's being given the right level and detail of information at the right time. Other ways that you can see it having a more practical impact is looking at investor feedback, looking at making sure stakeholders are considered, especially with listed organizations, looking at their regulatory objectives to make sure that key stakeholders have been considered, and whether it's ESG, whether it's, as we're seeing a lot in the financial services sector with consumers, how consumers are being not just considered as part of the business, day-to-day business operations, but how the board are ensuring that a customer-centric decision-making process is really embedded throughout the organization. The responses to that are some of the more practical outcomes. The financial services point is an interesting one that I'd like to pick up on a bit more, because when you mentioned the word outcomes, the difference that we're seeing with the focus on consumers at the moment is the shift from the way the FCA are looking at it, from a rules-based approach to an outcomes-based approach. That shift by nature means there is a more vague responsibility. A rules-based approach is very much, these are the tick boxes you need to do to have effective compliance and to have effective board and management relations. Now it's an outcomes-based approach. It's much vaguer, and it is, this is the outcome, in this case putting consumers at the heart of what we do, that we are driving towards as an organization. They're not being any more prescriptive than that. So what that means, it's important then, is for the board and the management team to be aligned on how do we, in this case, how do we demonstrate that we're putting consumers at the heart of what we do? And how are we making sure that every decision we make and every agenda item that we discuss has a nod to that? So you can see that come out in the reporting, but that's certainly one of the more practical applications that we're seeing, is really looking at how do you change that mindset and how do you change the culture shift of an organization to focus around key stakeholder priorities and to make sure that information is being escalated quickly and appropriately through the management team to the board.
Absolutely. Monica, it would be interesting to bring in some of the data you have been privy to in terms of how the board executive relations contribute to the culture of constructive debate. So what are some of the practical tools and what's required from both sides?
Many questions. So I am going back to the mutual openness and trust. That's fundamental. I mean, we're always coming back to those themes when we talk about constructive debate. I think our data, for instance, very interesting, shows that a very good collaboration within the board is a very strong indicator how well board interacts with the management. So without giving any numbers, I think that's a very interesting one. And again, the tone is set from the top in terms of a constructive debate. I think that's very important, and that's when you go out and ask the management how they analyze their impression of the board. Those numbers are very interesting because it's not always as the board believes about being a benchmark, etc. But building a communication-focused approach instead of reporting, as I mentioned earlier, that's really something that is also basis of the to create a constructive debate. But it requires a very strong cooperation between the board and management. I think that's also fundamental. And talking about data, so high level of interaction between the board and management strongly correlates to the board performance, innovation climate, but also the quality of reporting. Innovation 50% up, and strong interaction between those two stakeholders affects reporting up 35%. So some practical tools. So a constructive debate, you need to have the priorities, we talked about the priorities, right and aligned. Otherwise, you can't get the effectiveness going, and you need to identify the gaps in the alignment where they sit. Could be with whom and in what area. Could be strategy, culture, innovation, risk, etc. And I'm coming back to board evaluations. That really professional board evaluations should really underpin openness, feedback, constructive debate, as we're speaking about now, and also highlight clearly the areas for improvements and the most important, early warning signs, of course. And end of the day, successful boards make sure that the board and the CEO and the executive team end up on the same side of the challenges instead of questioning each other. That's really fundamental. Coming back to these two questions I mentioned earlier, and that's a very practical tool, being very specific. Where do you need our help? And both sides need to take responsibility for a constructive debate. That's my fundamental thinking. And it's about transparency, proactivity, thinking outside the box, courage to change traditional patterns, even turning the board agenda upside down. We had that with somebody, a board the other day. And you need to be courageous, and maybe you just change the board agenda, start from the very end, for instance. And again, look at data from your board evaluation, because that is the best way to guide each company forward.
Thank you. I'm watching the poll results here, and in the response to the question about the value perceived, the value that the executive team gets from the board, half of the audience thinks it's a high return on the time invested, and half of the audience thinks it's a bit of both. Nobody sees it as a necessary evil. Oliver, in the practical terms, what does the need to foster a constructive debate and the quest for maximization of the input from both sides, what does it mean in terms of recruitment?
Gosh, I wonder where all those CEOs are. Obviously not on the call. I think there are sort of three things you're thinking about. One is around sort of insight and competence. Second is around engagement, and the third is around diversity of perspectives. So insight competence, what we see, a lot of boards struggle to find people who are both have deep expertise, but also that general business experience and board suitability. And normally it's because they're just not casting that net wide enough. And so that is the key thing. When you're sometimes you hear boards say, well, we just can't find the person who offers exactly what we need. And normally it's just because they've looked in too small an area. Related to that, I would say, is the engagement piece. There's a good piece by McKinsey actually, again, around the average time spent by best-in-class board directors on a role, and it's something like 40 days. And certainly it's been my experience as well. Really good board directors stand out by the amount of time that they put in preparation outside the boardroom. And what we sort of see, you get some board members often where they've gone through more of a traditional process where they haven't really cast the net wide. They've gone for the same old names who already have a number of board roles, and they just don't have the time to give. Whereas when you go out beyond the sort of traditional and you find people who are really hungry for it, you create that competitive dynamic amongst the sort of candidate pool. You get people who are really putting in the time, really keen to show they're capable of doing the role. You see a similar pattern in other areas. It's like with first-time investment funds, they tend to outperform second-time investment funds. So that engagement is absolutely critical. And I think probably related to that is assessing board members. I was reading this wonderful bit of research recently where apparently at the age of 40, your brain volume starts declining at 0.2% a year. By the time you hit 60, it's 0.5% a year, and after that, it very quickly starts to look like Moore's law. So having, given how important it is for boards to be able to react, digest information, respond to live situations, it's not just experience, having some sort of thing in place that is assessing your board directors, because we do see quite a few where you think they're not capable of really responding anymore to live stimuli. And then the final piece is that sort of diversity of perspectives, which has been a hot topic for a while now. I think the key thing boards to think about is diversity is an infinite thing. No board could have diversity across all the dimensions possible. So it becomes a real question then of what's the sort of situationally most relevant diversity to have on your board. And when you get your first CEO on a board, it's really helpful. The second one, really helpful. Third one, probably diminishing returns. By the time you've got the fifth or sixth, just adding no incremental value. So thinking about that diversity of perspective is critical to fostering that constructive debate.
Thanks, Oliver. You have answered actually one of the questions from our audience members. And so it's a good opportunity to turn to Niamh with the same question, and I'm reading it from the Q&A. Is it possible that too many board members have become very good at sitting on the boards and less good at what is core and driving a company towards success?
Yeah, no, really interesting question. And where we see that manifest itself in our world in the board papers is when the board members, when either there are too many subject matter experts or there are not enough subject matter experts. Because if you have too many subject matter experts, then that is driving the conversation, driving the sort of information that they request down one quite narrow, very specific, often quite operational route. Or where you don't have enough subject matter experts, then the conversation then tends to be much broader, and it doesn't really focus on the need for the organisation where they are in their stage at the time. So I think it touches on what Oliver was saying, was depending on, all organisations are different, and depending on where they are in the evolution of their journey, where they are in their growth trajectory, where they are in their governance sophistication, the board members that they have and the information that they have needs to reflect that, but also needs to have the agility in there to be able to change over time.
Thank you. I particularly like this next question from the audience. I will go to Monica with that. When we talk about challenging times and at the times when a share price perhaps is underperforming, in this group's experience, how does a chair-CEO relationship get stretched and tested, and how it should be managed?
Most likely it is stressed and pressed. So what, actually I had the discussion the other day, it's taking a step back together. I think it's even more important to work as a team and to find a common agenda, to look at priorities, everything else on hold, put on hold, and focus on what really matters. But in order to do that, you need to have this mutual trust. Already from the beginning, you can't afford, you don't have time to build that now. That should be in place so you really can focus on what matters, like in this case, I would say. So really holding hands together and just focus. That is what I would say, that being very efficient. Can I just touch on something you said, Oliver? We just dive into data in terms of how much time people directors spend on board work, because it's true, you need to spend so much time today. Our data shows, interestingly, that directors spend somewhat less time during the last year than earlier, and we don't see any correlation between really effective boards and the time spent. So that's really interesting. We're going to follow this going forward, but we were all a bit like.
And how do you measure?
Surprised.
How do you measure effective boards in that?
Oh, all these aspects. That for everything from all tasks you really need. You have on the board agenda. So effective boards is built on a number of dimensions. End of the day, the value you create during the time you have available. So that's why you need to have a board agenda that is very effective. The board effectiveness is really create create the most value.
But as measured by the exec, as measured by the non-exec?
We measure how much time different people put into the board work. And then when we take all dimensions together, we get a BoardClic value score, basically measuring effectiveness.
Interesting. It seems very counterintuitive to me, and goes against my own personal experience.
Ours as well. That's why I mentioned it. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. So, but this was just the first time we actually dived into that and coming back.
Interesting.
Yes.
Thank you. And by the way, please feel free to jump in on any other questions that the audience is posing. But this next question is related to what you just touched on. And that question is about getting some good advice on how to deal with underperforming board members who are just taking up seats and not contributing sufficiently. So some practical points, and I'll go to actually each one of you for some practical advice.
Yeah, we get this question a lot. And I think what surprises me is how few boards have in place a proper performance management program in place, a sort of a board review system that makes it easy to have those discussions in the way that you would with an exec team. Obviously, sort of time-bound sort of tenures are helpful. And then sort of, it comes down to the chair. Ultimately, it's the sort of chair's responsibility. And if the chair's not performing, then you've got a real problem as a board member, and then, it's your SID. So it's I think the key thing is making sure that you've got clear performance measures, expectations up front, and you're sitting down regularly and reviewing this.
Thank you.
Agree. I'm very fond of facts and figures and data. So I also know that it doesn't matter how experienced you are as a chair. This is something you can really. It's not anything you love. Bringing up these conversations, because often it is very loyal. It's about very loyal directors that have been around and have been really contributing a lot. But as times are changing, you also need to update your board if you look ahead. I strongly believe that it's about having a fact-based conversation with these people. And of course, if you do your homework in a proper board evaluation that is based on facts and data related to that, it is much easier because it's not about how the chair feels, it's about facts and figures. So it becomes a very objective and professional conversation. And most often also the person in focus fully understands.
And how soon? That's
the sooner the better.
Niamh?
I completely agree with what's been said. I think it goes back to the role of the chair and the confidence and strength of the chair to, exactly as you say, sooner rather than later, to make the call that something isn't working, to put the needs of the organisation above the needs of the board, in the sense of making sure that the right people are around the board for where the organisation is going, and therefore having the confidence and strength to make that call to say, actually, either you're not right for the type of organisation we are right now, or you're not right for us as a board. But exactly to your point, a facts-based conversation that is done sooner rather than later stops a sort of febrile environment.
And of course, the more often you use an advanced feedback loop in some way or another, the more it doesn't come as a surprise. It's the same in the organization as in the board. So if you used to get feedback and give and get feedback a couple of times a year, it should never come as a surprise.
I think one of the other things that you can also do that I've seen used effectively a few times is putting it to the saying board members want to do well, and if you put it to them, if you're first of all clear about what is it that we're trying to achieve, and then asking them how is it that you're contributing to that? Can we sort of tangibly point to things in the last 2-3 years? And often not often, but sometimes that'll come out where they're like, what can I point to? And then if you've identified what it is that you do need, then it becomes a much easier discussion to say, look, we've got a return on sort of time invested, capital allocated decision here. I think it makes more sense to us to be investing in someone who could bring more of this relative to the value you're bringing. And again, that becomes a sort of more objective discussion. It's not personal.
Yeah. No companies can afford these days, nor the owners, to postpone those kind of decisions.
And no delay, supposedly.
Yeah, I think it's, again, that's what the advantage of that discussion is, opening it up to them, because sometimes you can be missing the value, and sometimes you'll get board members who are very quiet and their value comes at a moment when you least expect it. So there's a sort of balance to be struck there, and then you have some board members who I almost think of as like an insurance policy. You don't realize the value of them until they spot the thing that you didn't have. So it's somewhere to tread carefully. But in my experience, typically, you know pretty quickly. People don't, if you've got doubts, they tend to grow rather than you see people recovering from it.
But it's true, because if you have very competent board members but they don't contribute so much, it can very well be about the chair. But if you're lacking the experience, then most likely you need to maybe leave the board. So it depends really. Sometimes you can encourage people also to be more active.
Yeah,
and that's a good thing.
Trying to diagnose, is it about the insight they bring? Is it about the engagement they bring? Is it about expectations? And I think once you've got that clarity around what the issue is, then it's much easier to change.
And my experience is that you need to clarify the role. We talk about the role of the board, but the role of each director. Because if you come from operations and if you're not a very experienced board member, it's not always given that you really understand the role of a board member. So that's then for the chair to dive into.
And often you see board members actually very uncomfortable about raising this, that someone else is not at it, pulling their weight. And one way actually I have talked to chairs about doing this is, you have a sort of positive balloon debate, like if we can only keep 2 or 3 of our board members on, who are the 3 that you would keep on? And if you get that sort of feedback from the rest of your board that basically, it's the same 3 people who are voted on and no one else, it gives you that very strong signal that no one else is seeing the value. And you can do that in a very sensitive, anonymized way.
But it's getting more and more common, and in some countries even must with peer reviews in the board, and then you get all of this like up in the air, which is very value creation, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you for this unique perspectives, and it just underscores that governance is not a science, it's an art. And therefore, this outcomes-based approach, as opposed to the rules-based approach, is so critical. And this next question from the audience is about aligning short-term and long-term objectives. It's about how does a good board manage investors' expectations against what might be best for the more short-term and what might be best for the long-term growth of a company. And the two are not always aligned.
Niamh. It's an interesting question. Where we see that play out more specifically in our world is looking at, as you say, the balance between the short-term perspectives and the short-term metrics and the short-term performance updates that are then given to the board by the management team, and the longer-term, more horizon scanning information and therefore conversations. And again, we touched on it earlier, when what we find is when organizations are very much focused down on the short term, the almost the quarterly reporting, the kind of immediate metrics, what that then starts to engender is a culture of, we touched on it earlier, papers are much more operational, conversations are much more operational, and the line between board and between management team gets blurred. When you take a longer term horizon and make sure that the board are given the right information, that the management team are thinking about things on a long term. It's not solely long term, there's a balance between short and long term, and it depends on the stakeholders that the organization needs to be, so to speak, but actually making sure that there is a consistent long term time horizon and perspective given throughout all conversations, throughout agendas, and throughout the people that you have on your board, and then the information that you facilitate them with. That stops you falling into the trap of solely focusing on a quarterly reporting, a short-term box ticking. Are we doing what we're doing, and are we performing in the way that we said we are? Yes, we are, but where does that fit into our board's strategic priorities, and how can we be confident and clear that the direction we're going in as a business is the right one for us if we're only focused down here?
Thank you. Oliver.
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one, and it's that sort of classic Warren Buffett quote of sort of voting versus weighing, that the market will vote, but over the long term, if you're creating true value, that will shine through. And how do you balance that? I mean, the best businesses that I see, the ones who tend to manage expectations. I mean, BoardClic is a good example in that front, in that they limit the amount of emphasis that they place on those short-term reports. And I know from my own experience as an investor, I used to spend a lot of time worrying about projections. And now as a sort of CEO, I'm not thinking about the short term at all. I'm thinking about other things in the long term, and it's a long-term trajectory that will really affect whether you're winning or not. So I think for boards, they've got to live within the some of the constraints that they're placed under, but I would always be pushing people to focus on that long term.
Monica.
I'm thinking, isn't that one of the main tasks for the board, to really have the long-term perspective and helping the C-suite, the management, to have that as well, balance much more and including the short-term perspective? But I would say that's one of the main tasks. So, and that's why it is a hard game to be a board member. It's not an easy task. And if you don't succeed with that in the board or in the company, then you have all the disruptors coming. So you need to have your eyes on the future these days. So I would say that's a very task for the board.
Just, I suppose, one thing to add on that, I think it does require confidence, humility, because the market will often tell you things, and I've definitely been there as an investor where we feel like we've seen something, and the chair and the board have sort of sat there doggedly saying, no, we're right. And in that particular case, we happen to be right. And I think there's a function of the market, and there's the short-term challenges that you get from your external stakeholders, which should just make you continually check your assumptions. You might be right, and hence why I say sort of confident humility, but always have the humility of, gosh, did we miss something? I think that's the balance to strike.
I like that, confident humility.
Yes.
Actually, talking about qualities, there is a question here about how do you make sure that the true qualities of individual board members shine through, and the qualities such as ideas, motivation that drives them, and how does that shine through, especially in the regimented process of running a PLC board?
Yeah. It's challenging. I think one of the worries that personally I have when I see a lot of, for example, we see very few founders putting themselves forward for PLC board roles because they see the level of governance and regulation. They just think, why would I do that?
Yeah.
It's just too painful. So I think it's a real issue.
We track that actually, how the board members are seeing if the board leverages their competencies, or why they came into the board or onto the board. I don't have the data here now, but it's a very interesting question. And I also know for sure, having been a recruiter earlier, that it's hard to give return on your like bring your competencies into the board sometimes, because the board itself is not mature to receive what I come with, especially when you have a specific experience in digital. It's not that specific these days, but used to be. So shine through. I think that's also the very task for the chair, to get everyone involved and engaged in the board and in the tasks at hand, actually. I think that's the role of the chair.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely, the role of the chair, and almost the subtle role of the chair in knowing and understanding their board members and what they can bring, and then allowing not just the time in the meetings, but allowing when they look at their board agenda, be that the current meeting, be that over the next 6, 9, 12 months, making sure that it's structured in a way that allows each of the board members to bring their own, be it specialist knowledge, be it their own unique take and insight, to bear in the conversations. But I think absolutely right, it goes back to the role and the ability of the chair to understand their board members and B, spot when they're not able to shine as much as they would like.
Because it's a fact these days that if you don't, if you can't leverage your experience and your competence, directors leave. They are leaving the board because a really good and skilled director have many options. So if you don't nurture the people you recruit to the board,
as you're building on that, we had a great guest on our podcast recently called Owen Eastwood, who's a performance coach and worked with the New Zealand All Blacks and Manchester City Football Club, all these different high-performing teams. And he's written a book called Belonging, which is all about how do you create a sense of belonging in a team. He was talking about it in a board context and how often you'll hear people say, well, we'll give them 12, 18 months to get up to speed. His point was actually 18 months of not contributing, that's not high performance. You need people to be contributing from the get-go. And how do you as a board create that sense of belonging so that people's personalities can come to the fore? And particularly when you're thinking about board members from diverse backgrounds or underrepresented backgrounds, often they will not be made to feel welcome in those boards. And again, it goes back to the chair to be really thinking about, how do you create that space so that they can flourish?
Thank you. And then final question, I thought it would be great to wrap up with this. It's a question from a new COSAC, so congratulations, whoever you are. And this person is asking for 3 pieces of advice, or several pieces of advice to give them some practical tools to run high quality meetings. So to ensure the contribution, I presume, to underscore effectiveness of decision making in the boardroom and deliver the outcomes that are expected. A few key final pieces of advice to our practitioners in the audience.
I think preparation is everything. So good preparation. And knowing what you should preparing for, having an agenda, the 2 questions we talked about and so on. And I also believe that if you feel that you're trusted by other parties, you sort of flourish much more. So building that trust again is really important in the boardroom or between the board and the CEO. I come back with this.
I think mine would be on a more practical basis. So for a new COSEC, actually, you have the opportunity to come in and look at your governance, look at your processes, but also look at the papers. And so the very obvious one is start by how long are they? Because typically, I obviously don't know the organization that you're from, but typically there'll be multiple hundreds, if not thousands of pages long. That is the starting point. That can't be a way to have an effective board conversation to make sure that the board management relationship is running as effectively as it could. So start by looking at the content of the papers, and then start by looking at, depending on where you sit in the governance structure, but looking at the people that write those papers. Are they supported to write them in the right way? Do they understand what the priorities of the board are? And how is that translated into the papers themselves? And at COSEC, you have a unique opportunity because you are the middle point between the board and between the management team and the report writers in the business. So making sure you are all over the flow of information where you currently have and where you want to get to. I think that's the critical starting point.
Thank you. Oliver.
I think one of my favourite lenses for looking at this comes from Patrick Dunn, who's written a book called Boards, where he talks about people, purpose, process. And we touched a little bit on purpose earlier around alignment, vision, process. If you haven't got your board papers and you're not doing your sort of board assessment, then you've got problems, agendas, all those sorts of things. But ultimately, for me, it comes back to people, and it's a little bit like cooking. If you haven't got good ingredients, it's very hard to make a really outstanding meal. And I think as a COSEC, you have the really great COSECs that I come across really influence their boards and challenge them, and they won't let those board members who are not pulling their weight go for long, and they'll be pushing the chair saying, come on, we can do better than this, we can go out, we can find some really extraordinary people who can change this. And once you've got those extraordinary people in the room, actually a lot of the rest takes care of itself. So for me, it would come back to that, people, making sure that as a COSEC you're influencing boards to cast the net wide from the very best.
It's all about continuously raising the bar. And that's what you also.
Thank you. I would like to thank our audience, and I would like to thank our panelists for your practical insights into what it takes, not just to bring the right competencies into the boardroom, but also to maximize their input and to build a real effective outcomes-focused governance. Thank you so much from the London Stock Exchange. And as a reminder, this session will live on Spark Live, and you can rewatch it at your convenience. Have a nice day.